Question for you. Which of these two items do you think is going to give me more dodge chance on my character? Do you think it is A, from the aspect, which gives me 8% increased dodge chance? Or B, do you think the 8.1% dodge chance from the temper will give me more dodge chance? So again, here are your choices, A, B, or maybe C, you're thinking, it's probably about the same, right? Is there really going to be much of a difference? So take a moment, pause the video if you'd like, think about it, and then we'll take a look in game. I ran a poll here about 26 minutes ago. 116 of you guys responded to see what you guys thought about this before I decided to make this video. And here are the results. We can see that we're pretty split here between these, with the lowest one being the 8% dodge chance from the aspect. All right, let's go take a look. All right, so let's see if you were correct. So we can see here I got 49% dodge chance. So first let's put on the helm, which has the aspect with 8% increased dodge chance. So again, 49%. We put it on and it goes up to 57%. So we gained 8% dodge chance as we might expect. All right, let's take that off. And now let's try the amulet. So we can see the amulet has 8.1% dodge chance. So let's put that on and let's see what happens. We went up to 54.7%. So we only went up not 8%, but we went up 5.7%. So we can see it goes up only 5.7%, while the helm went up 8%. So even though the amulet says 8.1%, which is higher than 8%, well, it turns out the 8% aspect gave us more. So we're going to talk about why that is, and we're going to talk about how to figure out exactly how much certain things in the game give us for dodge. And then we'll talk about what are some of the consequences of that and how we can use this to our advantage in order to make our builds better. So to begin understanding how dodge gets calculated, we can break down dodge into two categories. So dodge could be broken down into things that are multiplicative, and these would be things like tempers on your gear, so that dodge temper, and affixes. And then we could also break this down into additive. And the stuff that's additive is relatively simple, and we'll come back to that in a moment here. But first, let's talk about how the multiplicative tempers get valued. All right, so in order to understand how dodge works with our affixes and how that gets calculated, what we can do is an example. So let's say that you are attacked 100 times, and we'd like to know how many times would you actually get hit if you have, say, a certain amount of dodge stacks. So in game, we can see that each piece of gear can have one or even multiple stacks of dodge chance for an affix. So for example, my chest piece here in yellow, we can see it has a stack of 10.7% dodge chance. Or on my legs, you can see it has two stacks of dodge chances, both affixes, an 11.7% and an 11%. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through a calculation here to see how each of these dodge chances kind of stacks up in a sense to figure out our effective dodge chance. And we'll just assume that all of these stacks are, let's just say 10%, just to keep the numbers a little bit simpler. So let's say that we have one 10% dodge stack on our gear, and that's all that we have. Then from this, we could figure out, well, what would the amount of hits that I take, how many hits would I dodge, and what would my multiplicative effective dodge percent be? All right, well, if I only have one stack of 10% dodge, then my effective dodge chance would be 10%. Pretty simple. So how many hits would we dodge? Well, if we get attacked 100 times, then I would dodge 10% of those, which 10% of 10, or sorry, 10% of 100 is 10. So how many hits do I take? Well, I take 90. All right. Well, now it gets a little bit more interesting. So now let's say we have two stacks of 10% dodge. Well, the idea is that the first stack of 10% dodge would have dodged 10 of those attacks, 10 of the 100 attacks, which leaves us with 90 attacks that may still hit us. Then what happens is that second stack is going to effectively check and see, well, of those 90 attacks that got through from the first stack, how many of those would get dodged from the second stack? So we can simply take 10% of the amount of attacks that would have gotten through, which is 90, and 10% of 90, well, that's divided by 10. 90 divided by 10 is 9. So 9 attacks would get dodged from the second stack. So what we could do is that 10 would be now 19, because we'd add the 9 more attacks that got dodged, which means how many attacks did we end up taking? Well, we would then subtract 9 to get 81. So now we only take 81 hits. So what's my effective dodge chance then? Well, I dodged 19 out of the 100 attacks. So that would mean that I have an effective dodge chance of 19%. Okay. So notice that that second 10% did not make me go up to 20%. It only made me go up to 19%. So I went up 9%. Now let's try this again here. And let's say now we have 3 stacks. So I put on another stack of dodge. Well, then we could do this again and we say, well, previously 81 attacks got through. Well, now we can say that 10% of those is now going to get dodged. So 10% of 81, 81 divided by 10 is 8.1. So 8.1 more attacks are going to get dodged. So if we add 8.1 to my 19, then I get 27.1 attacks are now dodged, which means how many hits did we take? Well, 100 minus 27.1 would be 72.9. So now what's my effective dodge percent? Well, I dodged 27.1 out of 100 attacks, so my effective dodge percent is 27.1%. And this is what is going to read in the game when you add on this another 10% multiplier there. So what we can see from this, right, is that each time I add 10%, I'm effectively getting less dodge added to it, right? So I go from here, this is plus 9, from 19 to 7.1, that's plus 8.1. And if I did this again, another 10%, then again, it would go up even less. And this gets more extreme the higher dodge values that we have. So for example, if we were to continue this on, and let's say, we kind of continue this on for a while, and then let's say eventually we end up having, let's just pretend we end up having like 80% effective dodge chance, which then means that how many attacks would we dodge? Well, we'd dodge 80 out of the 100, which means 20 of them would get through. So now let's go down one more row here. So let's say we add another stack here. Well, then how many attacks would that 10% additional stack dodge? Well, 10% of 20 would be 2. So we dodge 2 more attacks. So now we would end up dodging 82 attacks, and 18 of them would get through, which means our effective dodge went up by 2%. So by adding another stack, we only end up getting another 2% added on. Now, one thing I do want to clarify here is that some people would say that this is diminishing returns. And if you watched my damage return videos in the past, you know that this actually isn't diminishing returns. And I know it kind of sounds confusing, but as we can see here, we are still getting 10% of what's left being removed in a sense. And this actually increases our effective HP the same amount as the first 10% stack did. And maybe I'll have to make another video on that later on if that's confusing, but I'd recommend go check out my DR videos, and I go through this in a little bit more detail as to why this is really not diminishing returns. Now, Another thing that is multiplicative is on rogues, there's the passive skill Agile that adds dodge chance. This is also multiplicative, so keep that in mind. That's the one that you have to use a cooldown to get additional dodge chance, so it does go in this multiplicative category. Now, let's talk about additive. So what things are additive? Well, if you look closely on the aspect, they give you a little plus sign here that lets you know that it is additive. So an aspect that we see here is simply additive. And then also dex, the stat, is also additive, where 100 dex is equal to 1% additive. And additive is very simple. It simply adds to your multiplicative dodge percent. Okay, so let's look at an example putting these together to see how this all works. So for example, let's say we have three 10% affixes, and as we saw before, these are multiplicative. And in our table down below, we saw that our effective multiplicative dodge chance would be 27.1% from these. Now, let's say we have one 8% aspect, so that would be additive. So this would give us 8%. And then the 2000 dex, every 100 dex, again, 100 dex is equal to 1% additive. So the 2000 dex then, 2000 divided by 100 is 20. So this is, again, additive. So this would give us 20%. And to figure out what the tooltip is going to tell us, we simply add these three together. So 27.1 plus 8% plus 20% would give us 55.1%. And this would be your total dodge chance that you would see in game. And the thing to take away from that, though, is to see just how powerful additive dodge chance is. Because in order to go up by that 28%, if we were to try to do that using affixes, it would take a lot more than plus 28% dodge, because as we saw before, you get less of it effectively as you use more multipliers. All right, question for you. Let's say that you currently have 90% total dodge and 2000 dexterity. And let's say you have an amulet that gives you plus 10% dexterity. And you're wondering, do I want to keep re-rolling this, go for something else like lucky hit chance, or maybe something like another passive like exploit or something in order to try and get more damage? Well, if you think about it from another perspective instead of just damage, well, what if you think about it also in terms of the dodge and how much is that going to help keep you alive? Well, how much would that help you? Well, if we have 2000 dex currently, if we take 10%, let's just ignore the 0.2 here, make our math easier, 10% of 2000, then that would give us 200 more dex. So that 200 dex, that is equivalent to 2% dodge. Okay. And that 2% dodge, it is additive. So now we're going to go from 90% total dodge to 92% total dodge. And again, that plus 2% might not seem that much, but if you think about it, how much would that be if this was like a multiplicative multiplier? How much really multiplicative dodge chance would you have needed to get that extra 2%? Well, to figure that out, we simply take how much we're gaining 2%, and we divide that by the amount of times that we would get hit, essentially, if we didn't have this. So we would have gotten hit 10% of the time. So 2% divided by 10%, that is 0.2 or 20%. So this would be like equivalent to getting a 20% multiplicative dodge multiplier. So this extra 2% here, this is equivalent to 20% multiplicative in this scenario. If we had a different amount of dodge, so if I only had like 50% total dodge, well, then it would be equivalent to something less than 20%. So it's important that you really kind of think about these, what's your current situation, in order to figure out how much is this going to help you. Because dodging 20% more attacks, that's a lot. That's going to give you a whole lot more effective HP. All right, so Sanctum has made a calculator for the dodge chance that quickly summarizes the information in the video, as well as allows you to quickly calculate it if you don't want to have to pull up the calculator yourself. But by knowing this stuff and understanding what's additive, what's multiplicative, how it all works, you're going to be able to better use this calculator and better optimize and make better choices, hopefully. So just to quickly go over how this works, simply on the left side, we have all the multiplicative stuff, so tempers and affixes and our agile passive, and you can simply click these on or off to which one do you have and type in your values. So we can see, for example, here if I have the leg tempers and affix and the boot affixes of 10, 14.1, and 15.4, then our total multiplicative value for our dodge is 34.6. And then we can type in how much dexterity we have. So if I have, say, let's say 2000 dexterity, and if I'm using the assimilation aspect, which gives me another 8%. So I get 20% from the dexterity, 8% from assimilation, which gives me total 28%. And then the calculator simply adds 28 plus 34.6 to give me my total dodge of 62.6%. So hope you guys found this video helpful. Hopefully it clarified how dodge gets calculated and some things that you might want to think about when you are making your builds to optimize them and make them perform a bit better. If you guys enjoyed this video, then feel free to hit that like and subscribe button, and hopefully I'll be able to give you guys some more great information in the future. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye. Thanks.